just to say that this project is actually something that we started when I was based at the University of Liverpool, led by Professor Dan Pope. It's actually a whole programme, so you may have heard me talk about elements of this programme in Cameroon. But Korede and I today are going to talk specifically about the qualitative work that we've been doing with stakeholders and householders in Cameroon around the uptake of LPG.
Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Korede, and I'm just going to start off the presentation by giving a little background on household air pollution. So household air pollution is one of the major environmental health problems of today, and it's responsible for over 4 million deaths annually, which is 45 times the number of annual deaths from natural disasters and twice the number of deaths from AIDS. When open fires are burnt within the households, levels of particulate matter rise, which is twice the level of WHO guidelines. And the people at most risk of these environmental hazards are children and women, because they are the ones that do most of the cooking. So I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Debbi, who is going to talk about a framework that was developed for LPG adoption.
Okay, thank you. So, as I mentioned, this particular piece of work, we were looking at trying to enhance adoption of liquid petroleum gas, which is a clean fuel. And we were doing that in an area where people were mostly using biomass wood, and some people were also using LPG, at least some of the time. So this is a framework that we used, and in fact we have adapted it since then. It was developed by Quinn et al, and you may have seen me use this before. I'm quite fond of it, but I think it gives a good idea that there are many, many different domains that are involved when you start looking at trying to promote cleaner fuels. So it's not just about telling people that fuels are problematic, that biomass is problematic. There is a whole system that you need behind it to support that. And you can see the different domains here that illustrate that. So you need an enabling environment, you need the right policies, you need proper structure within your industry, the energy pricing and costing, so the price of cleaner fuels in relation to other fuels is important to think about. The kind of factors that influence consumer demand, you need to be aware of all those. And then you need to be very clear about the householders' perceptions and very importantly, their preferred cooking methods, what they're actually looking for in terms of cooking needs. Okay.
So in an attempt to increase LPG adoption in South West Cameroon, 2 studies were carried out to explore the barriers and enablers for LPG adoption. So firstly, this presentation is going to report the findings from the latest one research that was done in Cameroon. And firstly, 30 qualitative interviews and 2 focus group studies were done with different households in Cameroon, while 11 semi-structured interviews were done with the stakeholders at different levels of the supply chain, which included the retailers, the chief of the communities, and so on, to find out what the barriers in LPG adoption.
Okay, so we'll move on to some of the results. I'm going to talk about the householders, and I'm going to talk about 4 different themes very briefly. Firstly, affordability. This was the main reason that people gave for not investing in LPG stoves. And also for those people that were already using stoves, it was the main reason for what we call stove stacking. Now that means where people actually choose to go back to the 3-stone fire or what they would have used previously because they couldn't afford to perhaps buy another refill. The participants were actually aware of how much of the cost of firewood, if they were having to buy firewood rather than collect it, it worked out more expensive over a monthly period. But what they found very difficult was saving up enough to buy the LPG refill over a 1-month period. So as many of us do, we live day to day with the money that we have available at that time. They also talked about convenience and the importance of meeting cooking needs and the ability to perhaps cook for a large number of people. That would mean that they'd often light the biomass stove or the 3-stone fire alongside their LPG. And they also talked about practical problems in relation to LPG refills. Quite often they weren't available, or they'd have to go on a motorbike many, many miles to try and find the cylinders that they needed. So because there were supply chain problems, it was almost impossible to use exclusively. They mentioned safety concerns as being an issue because there were quite often serious problems and the cylinders themselves were not always safe. And finally, they knew that health was an important issue. It wasn't that they weren't aware of that. It was important to them to move to cleaner fuels, but they just didn't feel that they quite had the option to do that.
Okay, so I'm just going to discuss the results from the stakeholder findings, and we group them into two main categories, which were factors affecting demand and then factors affecting supply. So in terms of the supply, most stakeholders mentioned that there's actually a very limited infrastructure for gas production and for storage in Cameroon, which affects the supply. Also, the storage facilities are very minimal in terms of actually storing the LPG that's even produced in Cameroon. There's also hindrances in importation of LPG from other countries. And then there's problems with distribution of LPG around Cameroon as well due to vehicle breakdowns or poor documents to actually transport the gases to different parts of Cameroon. And then for factors affecting demand, it's very similar to what Dr. Debbi has said concerning what householders felt like what hindrances in actually wanting to use LPG. They find it difficult to actually afford LPG, to afford the kit, and to afford the gas itself. They also find it hard to access LPG because most of them live in rural areas, and most LPG are only found in more urban areas. And so it's hard for them to access this as well, and the availability to them is also limited. And most of them see use of LPG as a form of luxury. They don't see it as a form of necessity. And some of them also see use of LPG as unsafe. They see it as, because there are some stories they've heard about use of LPG and how it's affected people's health or killed certain people because of the mishandling of LPG. So they're afraid to actually, start using LPG. And some of them don't feel like it actually meets their cooking needs because they're not able to cook some of the things they are able to do.
Okay, so we're getting the zero sign now. So I'll just say very briefly, in conclusion, we think it's very important to start from the perspective of the householder instead of some of us where you often find that projects start with a particular stove, and that you will have noticed that both the householders and the stakeholders were very clear about some of those issues, and it's very important that we link the householders' views with the stakeholders, the retailers and the distributors, so that they have a fuller picture of what the issue might be, and industry can learn from householder knowledge. Thank you very much.
You were able to speak a little bit about inter-household dynamics and how that might have affected or might affect in the future.
Okay, did you say inter or intra? Intra. Yes, that's very important. One of the areas that we look at a lot and we couldn't cover in 7 minutes is around gender. As you would expect, women would do most of the cooking and also most of the childcare, so they very often had the children with them at the time of cooking, so they had the worst health experience. But also, in another study that I did in Kenya, one of the things we were looking at was household dynamics in relation to decision making. So where there might be money available to buy a better cook stove or an LPG stove, there was quite a task there for women to convince their husbands that it was a good idea to do that because they wouldn't necessarily see it as a priority. So there's definitely an argument there for getting men on board, and that's one of the focuses that we want to use in our next project, if we get funding, Ashlyn, which will be a village approach, where we're actually able to involve the men in that decision making and hopefully be able to influence those dynamics. A great question.